Welcome back to the show, everybody, and today I am going to teach you how to paint a black dragon. Now, for those of you that don't know, in Dungeons & Dragons, black dragons usually dwell in swamps, and often when I see black dragons painted, they tend to be painted with a heavy emphasis on blues and purples. However, I decided to take a little bit of a different route with it, and I really wanted to emphasize the swamp theme. So we are going to rely mostly on greens and grays. We're beginning with 4 colors. We have Panzer Ace's Dark Rubber, which is the darkness that we need. I didn't want a color that was too blue or too green, so I decided to mix Scurvy Green with Stormy Blue together. And that gave me kind of the slight bluish green dark tone that I wanted. However, it wasn't dark enough, so I decided to add a little bit of black into it as well. And with this mixture, we began our first coat, which is a very simple dry brush over nearly the entirety of the model. This is a heavy dry brush applied directly over our black primer, and I'm dry brushing pretty much everything here because at the moment I don't know what colors I want to be what. This dry brush is going to take care of majority of the smaller scale areas that are a little bit too small or inconvenient to paint individually. For our second coat, I've basically eliminated the black from the mixture that we used previously, so you can see it's much lighter now. And also, we're not dry brushing anymore, trying to get a bit more specific with our highlights, picking out individual scales and adding a lot more details to the especially larger ones. For our third coat, introducing a new color into the mix because I need a lighter shade of blue to lighten things up. So I added some Vallejo Model Color Dark Blue Gray. However, to prevent it from going too blue, I also had to balance that out by adding a little bit more of our Scurvy Green to our mixture. We are concentrating this highlight mainly in the upper portions, the areas that are going to catch a lot of light. So top area of the dragon, also some of the larger scales, which need a little bit of extra highlighting. For the moment, we are done with a majority of our scales, and we're going to move on to the underbelly. Black dragons traditionally have a yellow underbelly, and I'm going to go with something similar to that. However, I'm going to add a little bit of green to the mix. Starting out with Vallejo Model Color Russian Uniform for our first coat, and then for our second coat, I'm adding an equal amount of Vallejo Model Color Green Ochre to that. And you can see here we're using a fairly large brush to begin with, so we can deposit a large amount of paint down. We have a big flat surface area here, so we can easily do that, and then switch to a smaller brush as we get into the finer details. Moving on to just straight green ochre, you can see we've switched to a smaller brush now. We're working on smaller details, really trying to bring the texture out of those thick, heavy looking underbelly plates. From here, we are going to add some pale yellow, and then finally add some white. As you can see, each layer goes on top of the previous layer, but doesn't completely cover it up. So basically, we just keep redefining the colors on the underbelly, slowly working ourselves to all those somewhat sharp-looking jagged edges of our very thick armored plates. With all our highlighting done, we have a very yellow underbelly, not quite as green as I want it though, so decided to go back and using some dark military green, add some wash into the recesses, give it a little bit of a green tint, which is going to help to eventually tie it into the rest of our dragon. For the back spine, I went with, once again, breaking out our Scurvy green, and then I added white to it a couple times for highlights, which gave us this very intense, kind of glowing, very nice looking back spine. However, I ended up painting over this later on. I'm showing this to you now to explain why I had to redo it later, and I think you'll understand. Part of painting a dragon like this is breaking up the monotony. We simply just don't want a black dragon all over with the same highlighting and shading. We want to mix things up a little bit, make it more interesting. For example, the head, I suddenly realize it kind of appears like a skull with the sunken eyes and the kind of pulled back lips, exposed teeth. So why don't we paint it like a skull? We only need 2 layers, the first being khaki mixed with black, and then over that using straight khaki. We don't want to add too many highlights here because we are painting a dark, dank dragon, and we do want to keep our colors, for the most part, muted. We also want to do something a little different with the horns rather than a kind of standard straight black or bones color. Bones color is going to be a bit too bright. Black is too close to the color of the dragon. So instead, we start off with Vallejo model color olive brown, and you can see I'm dry brushing English uniform over that, going forward, leaving the olive brown in the deep recesses. Then for our highlights, we're going to do it twice, adding beige each time to the English uniform to lighten it up. And you can see here basically the same process as we painted the underbelly. These horns look very thick and heavy and worn, so we want to increase the contrast and really add to the chunkiness of them. In a few areas where the spikes on the scales kind of stood out, mainly around the head and on the arms, decided to paint those a little bit different. I went back to our original dark rubber, used that as a base coat, and then added some green ochre for the highlights. Time to move on to the interior wings, and these were a pain in the butt to paint just because of their shape. They're kind of hunched over and curled up, made it a little bit difficult to get a brush in there. Because of that, I wanted to keep things fairly simple, so starting off with a undercoat of olive brown, and once again using a mix of olive brown and English uniform. Notice we are using the same colors that we did on the horns, but we're going to mix up the highlights so it doesn't end up looking exactly the same. Next, we apply English uniform once again. However, we are applying it with the regular layering method here rather than the dry brushing, and because the application is different, it looks more intense, so we can actually use English uniform to highlight English uniform. And we are now really starting to pick out all those folds in the wings, making that texture really pop. Now here is where we differ from the horns. Rather than adding beige, I'm adding some game color dead flesh, which has much more of a green tone to it. Once again, you can see I'm trying to increase the contrast on the texture that's sculpted into the wings, so highlighting all those little folds in the wings. And once again, I am using a fairly large brush for this. I'm not using a teeny tiny brush. I'm using what's appropriate for the size of what we're painting. We went with more of a brown tone for the interior side of the wings, and therefore in the exterior I wanted to go with something more green. Using a mix of military green, olive brown once again, and black to get the proper ratio to begin with. And two things, hopefully you realize by now. A, those are all colors that we've already used elsewhere on the model. And B, most importantly, hopefully you notice that our theme for this dragon has mainly been green. Not everything is painted green, but everything contains at least some amount of green. And that's what's tying everything together. This part of the wings is painted pretty much the exact same way as the front part, so don't have a whole lot of commentary. I'm just going to let it play out. Will mention I added a few extra highlighting layers because it's much more prominent than the more hidden folded over inside of the wings. Also, my wings, most of the dragon actually in this rear left section had kind of a sandpaper texture to it, unfortunately, on the wings and along the back and left rear leg as well. So just mentioning that. Don't know if all the casts have that, but definitely mine did, which unfortunately does affect the final paint job. It's not as smooth as I would like. So we finally reached our final highlights. You can see all the colors we went through here, adding more uniform green and dead flesh to the previous mix until we are left with basically just pure uniform green and dead flesh. And also the entire process we did with this large flat number 2 brush, perfect for painting this large surface area. One final thing to do for the wings was add a little bit more shade in the recesses, and I'm using Stormy blue for that. Remember, while we have a majority green colors going on this model, our main scale color still has a hint of blue, so wanted just a little touch of blue in the wings, not enough to overpower the green, but if you look closely, it is there. Now finally we could return to the rear spine and repaint it, and I hope by now all of you out there realize why it needs to be repainted. Our Scurvy green spine was very pretty, but it was also very bright, and as you can see, we've used all very muted dark colors on this model, and so that bright spine really just stood out. So instead, I repainted it with the same colors that we used on the spikes on the elbows. Unfortunately, I ended up doing most of it off camera, but trust me, it's the same process, starting off with black mixed with green ochre and just mixing more in until we finish off with just straight green ochre. Last thing to do is the base, and again, we want to keep our dank color scheme going on throughout the terrain as well. So starting over, once again, our black primer, just giving all the stone a heavy dry brush of dark rubber. Remember, once again, that was one of our colors we used in our base coat, but we don't have it mixed with the blue and green this time, and also we're going to use different colors to highlight it. So we first add game color bone white to our dark rubber for our first highlight, and then we are going to add some pale sand for our second. And hopefully you can see the process here. First layer, very heavy dry brush. Second layer here, working on top of that. Not quite a dry brush. It's more of just a crude brush stroke that I'm using just to try to block in the upper sections of all the bricks. And then when we get to the third layer, well then once again we switch to a finer brush and work really on those edges. So you can see the narrowing of the painting process. We start big and bold, and then we work our way down to the finer details. And then to keep our dank, swampy look to the base, adding a very heavy, basically a glaze here. It's not much of a wash, but applying this in the recesses of the rocks where you figure moss or algae will collect due to the dampness. I had something really cool planned for the rest of the base, but it did not work, unfortunately, so I had to cover it all up with glue and gravel. Not something I recommend doing over a painted model. Once the glue is dry and the excess sand brushed away, we give it 2 very, very heavy washes of military green, allowing the gravel to dry completely between coats. Then once all that's dry, I gave it another heavy wash, a mix of military green and black. Remember, if ground is wet, it's going to be much darker than dry ground. So going with heavy greens for our algae greenery look, and then darker colors in a few areas for wet spots. Grass tufts seemed very inappropriate for a swampy ground, so decided to use a few other things. Adding some roots using, well, you can't get this stuff anymore. It's long out of production, but what this basically is, it's a scrubbing or scouring pad that's been painted or dyed brown, and you just rip off little chunks of it, and I'm using a mixture of white glue and water to just dip it in and then glue it to the base. And then final thing to do is to glue on some moss with super glue. One of these days I'm going to remember what the heck this stuff is called. I know it's not Spanish moss. I'm sure someone in the comments is going to answer the question for me. However, we can't just put this straight on. It actually needs to soak in glycerin for a couple days. Otherwise, after several months, it just wilts and dries out. So the glycerin will keep it looking as is. But once we get that on, we're done with our dragon. And here is our finished, dank, hard to photograph black dragon. So what did we learn in this video? Well, you can see that I used a very limited palette of colors. We kept repeating the same colors over. Dark rubber, military green, forms of ochre, and just kept reusing those throughout the project, but using them in different ratios and mixing them with different paints. Also, we kept the colors very muted and dark to go with the theme of a very swampy place, not a bright, colorful forest, but some place that just radiates death. And I think it really works. Last thing I will say is don't be afraid to add a variety of colors to your dragons just because in the name it has black or red or green or whatnot. Don't think that means you have to be exclusively limited by those colors. We used a lot of different colors on here. Majority of the dragon is still black, and you know what? That is good enough. So that's it for now. Thanks for watching, and I hope to see you next time. Bye-bye.
I love the smell of dragon breath in the morning.